At this point in the semester, it's no secret that the combination of the Great Depression and the New Deal fundamentally remade politics in American life. I think it's pretty safe to say it remade the normal mode of economics in American life. The other thing that it's going to do is it's going to really reshuffle American cultural norms at the same time. You do begin to see a culture that will emerge in the Great Depression New Deal era that is going to be very reflective of the times. To get you to understand what I'm talking about here, I want to begin with this conversation involving mass culture. We were first introduced to the concept of mass culture in the 1920s as we began to see an emergence of a truly national American culture. Fact of the matter is that mass culture would continue on into the 1930s, but with a very important twist. What is typically referred to as political culture encompasses this set of ideas, ideals, expectations, things of that variety where we're acknowledging a certain mode of operation. And that mode of operation, as the 1930s continues to unfold, is increasingly collective. Increasingly, we're all in this boat together. Increasingly, that groups that had been looking at the situation from the outside and wanting a place on the inside, increasingly you're going to see those groups that are going to be brought into the mainstream fold. And you see this very, very clearly in American culture. One last thing before we go any further, I think that you're going to find, regardless of whatever genre we're talking about, Franklin Roosevelt is going to be the star of every show and the hero of every story. So let's begin. The first genre of cultural expression that I'd like you to be mindful of that really does come into its own in the 1930s is what we would call the comic book. But before you can talk about the comic book, you got to talk a little bit about the comic strip. Comic strips really emerged from the modernization of American newspapers. And newspapers are, generally speaking, a relatively modern invention, especially what you think of when you think of a newspaper. In the early 20th century, we began to see the sectionalization of newspapers, national and world, local and state, sports, money, and of course, you'd also have a comic section as well. And a very early comic strip, just a very short blip of comics, that began appearing in national newspapers across the country would be that of Little Orphan Annie. And this was your classic girl next door getting into all kinds of hijinks and shenanigans. And if you wanted to find out what happened to her, you had to buy another copy of the Dallas Morning News, another copy of the New York Times, another copy of the Chicago Tribune. You get the idea, right? It was good for selling newspapers. It was good to sell to advertisers. But what Little Orphan Annie and other comic strips like it demonstrated was that there was money in the comic strip, and eventually you begin to see the emergence of the comic book. You think about comic book heroes like Superman and Batman. In the case of Superman, he's based right there in Metropolis, Washington, D.C. And it takes a Superman to remedy whatever situation that we're talking about. Superman is not from this world. He's from Krypton. He's from another planet, and he's literally a Superman. He's faster than a speeding bullet. He can leap buildings with one hop. And the people in Metropolis, the police force, is either too weak or too incompetent to do this on its own. And so when Lex Luthor comes and Superman fights him, it takes a Superman to remedy the situation. Might sound a little bit like Franklin Roosevelt, or the way that a lot of people look at Franklin Roosevelt, this super politician. Okay. Batman's another very good example when it comes to reflections of the Great Depression. Now, Batman is actually Bruce Wayne. He's a millionaire turned vigilante, and he takes the law into his own hands. And Gotham City, New York, they're not entirely sure what to make of him. Is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? Nobody's quite sure for certain. But he does fight these bad guys because, once again, the Gotham City police force is either too incompetent, or in some cases, they're out and out corrupt, and it takes somebody that is going to circumvent some of the finer points of the law. Now, think about it again, Franklin Roosevelt. We've talked about the court packing case, and we know that that was scandalous, and we know that essentially he was going around various aspects of democratic rule. And in Roosevelt's mind, anyway, he's doing this for the greater good. So once again, you begin to see some reflections of the Great Depression. There's also some Americanization elements to the institution that would be comics. If you're looking at the PowerPoint slide with me, you can see that those do not cost a lot of money. Furthermore, you can share them. You buy Superman, I buy Batman. When we get done reading each book, we trade, and we can extend the shelf life of our respective comics. Lastly, you don't exactly have to be a fluent English speaker. We're not talking about reading Shakespeare here to get the gist of what's happening in comic books. There's pictures, and it's probably written at maybe a second grade reading level. And so what this is going to do is it's going to Americanize the masses. You're going to see more of this national culture emerge, primarily because these things are being read and consumed in every corner of the country. Film really comes into its own in the 1930s. You begin to see some modernization of the industry. Probably most importantly, you begin to see audio sound being introduced into the film industry. But more importantly, you begin to see films that are very reflective of the times. Comedies like Duck Soup that poked fun at establishment norms, but at the same time were very reflective of the political culture. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, a guy played by Jimmy Stewart, is very naive in terms of how Washington works, assuming that it worked for the greater good of the American people. When he gets to Washington, he finds out that's not entirely the case. But my favorite, and is very reflective of the 1930s, would be The Wizard of Oz. And the central figure in The Wizard of Oz is Dorothy, this Kansas Midwestern farmer who has this dilemma. Her house has been blown into this parallel universe. There's a person that swears revenge, the Wicked Witch of the West. She's reflective of some of these national or natural disasters, like the Dust Bowl. Keep in mind, it's a twister that blows Dorothy's house away. And her dilemma, Dorothy's dilemma, is she's trying to get back to Kansas. And everybody says, the Munchkins, everybody comes out and they say, you need to follow the Yellow Brick Road and you need to go see Oz, the great and powerful, in the Emerald City. If anybody can fix your situation, certainly it is him. And so along the way, she runs into Scarecrow, he wants a brain, runs into Tin Man, he wants a heart, my own personal favorite, the Cowardly Lion, he wants courage. And all of these three descend upon the Emerald City, and Oz is discovered to be this guy that's just behind this curtain. He's no great fixer. He's not even all that powerful, let alone great. And when he fixes each of their problems, he does so very practically. I don't know about you, but this reminds me an awful lot of Franklin Roosevelt. A lot of people look at him as this great fixer, this economic wizard. Truth be told, a lot of the things that he implements are very practical, common sense sort of reforms designed to get the economy moving once again. And so in any case, you see film that really comes into its own and is very reflective of life and times in America in the 1930s. You also see this in sport, okay? 1932 was an Olympic year, and that year the games, the summer games, were going to be held in Los Angeles. And like any city then or now, the whole purpose is to show off to the rest of the world how great your city is. And Los Angeles wanted to make sure that the world knew that the Great Depression had magically bypassed them. Of course, it had not, and LA suffered from the same problems that were suffered in other cities throughout the world. To make sure that everybody knew that LA had problems and there was no Passover, so to speak, the workers in Chicago staged what came to be known as the Counter Olympics. And the thought was, if you were a working class athlete, you were supposed to boycott the LA Games, come to Chicago instead, to compete, but more importantly, bring attention to the crisis that was the Great Depression. Now, what I'm talking about comes to be known as the Counter Olympics, and it's designed to keep the world's attention on the suffering of the people that's caused by this great economic calamity. Maybe even more importantly, if you want to do this in the realm of Olympics, would be the track and field athlete Jesse Owens. Jesse Owens is going to compete in the Berlin Games. 1936, the Summer Games are held in Berlin. And he's not going to set records, he's going to obliterate records. But Berlin in 36 is really important because the person that's running Germany at that particular moment is Adolf Hitler, who's espousing this Aryan supremacy, the idea that the German race is the master race, and of course physically that's the case as well. And so if you're going to buy into this, then it ought to be German athlete after German athlete that's claiming gold medals, like they're Michael Phelps or something like that. Jesse Owens absolutely humiliated Adolf Hitler in the sense that nobody had anticipated this level of athletic dominance. But more importantly, and again, if you're looking at the PowerPoint slide there, you're seeing Jesse Owens, the bottom of that screen, saluting the American flag. It's a bit ironic in the sense that in certain parts of the United States, African Americans are not even allowed to register to vote, let alone cast a ballot in the most basic of democratic processes. But more importantly, Jesse Owens' humiliation of Adolf Hitler was almost seen as an American triumph over German totalitarianism. More importantly, it reflects this political culture of racial inclusion. You begin to see more people of the racial and ethnic minority being brought into the mainstream, and you see this in sport. Another very good example of that end would be the guy above Jesse Owens, the boxer there, Joe Louis. Um, Despite what some people might tell you, Joe Louis is not the first African American heavyweight champion of the boxing world. He's the second. He's a good example of this world of sport that's very reflective of the times. In 37, Joe Louis is this up and coming fighter, and he's seen as this indestructible force. It's not a matter of if he will become champ, it's when. But before he can do that, he's got to amass some very solid victories. And one of those victories is seen to come at the hands of a German fighter who's seen as a very good fighter, but well past his prime, guy by the name of Max Schmeling. Schmeling said that he had this secret to defeat Joe Louis. It turned out that when Joe Louis would jab with his left, he would drop his right arm and expose the entire right side of his face, and Schmeling exploited that, and it served as this huge upset. More importantly, Adolf Hitler pointed to it as proof of Aryan supremacy. But to Joe Louis, this was an absolute humiliation. This was a huge insult to his race. And even though eventually later on that year he went on to become heavyweight champion of the world, he refused to be called champ or even really wear the belt until he made his peace with Max Schmeling. In 1938, on Independence Day at Yankee Stadium, he's going to get this opportunity. This is the rematch between Louis and Schmeling. Louis is the champion, Schmeling is the challenger. And it took Joe Louis all of 57 seconds to achieve a technical knockout, a TKO. They literally had to stop the fight because Louis had beat him so badly. Once again, this is seen as an American democratic triumph over German Nazism. It's something that's playing itself out in the world of sport, but it also has very clear-cut reflections of the time, and that time in this particular case involves the growing threat of international fascism. But Lewis, much like Jesse Owens, is a very good example of racial inclusion. He was America's champion in the sense that all throughout the country you saw these banners that said Joe Louis knocked out Hitler. It really was seen as America's victory over this growing threat of fascism from Germany. In the bottom screen there, you're looking at a guy holding baseball bats over his shoulder. That guy is Detroit Tigers first baseman Hank Greenberg. And Greenberg is going to be a Jewish baseball player. Now, there had been Jewish baseball players in the majors before him, and there would be after him. But before Greenberg, no Jewish baseball player really wore their ethnic identity on their sleeve quite like he did. Okay? Not only did he not shorten his name, many Jewish baseball players tried to sound more Anglo by shortening or changing their names, but he let it be known that he was a practicing Orthodox Jew. There were certain days of the year that he simply would not have his services available because he needed to be in religious worship. In short, he did not apologize for his race or his ethnicity. And again, much like Jesse Owens, much like Joe Louis, this is a very good reflection of ethnic, racial, and in this particular case, religious inclusion. It's a reflection of our political culture. Last example, Amelia Earhart. Many of you may know her to be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. And you might be asking yourself, what does that have to do with athletics? If you saw a plane from the 1930s, you'd understand that it was a well-conditioned athlete that was required to fly in one of these planes. But at a time when women are just beginning to make a presence felt in the public world, Amelia Earhart does demonstrate this culture of inclusion that women, just like the racial and ethnic minorities that we've been talking about to this point, women need to be included in this bigger, broader democratic process known as American democracy. So this culture of inclusion, that's what I want to emphasize with the world of sport. I want to turn our attention to music, theater, and literature. There's a guy that I'm willing to bet you grew up on a grade school carpet somewhere singing the songs that he wrote, a guy by the name of Woody Guthrie. Guthrie was this singer-songwriter from Oklahoma who wrote really the soundtrack of the Great Depression. Probably his most famous song was This Land Is Your Land. And you don't typically think about how heavy those lyrics are, but they're very reflective of the times. His condemnation of private property. I roamed and rambled and parked my footsteps on the gates of her diamond desert. And when I got there, I saw a sign that said no trespassing. He's talking about private property and his condemnation of private property, right? Capital. But on the other side, it didn't say nothing, and that side was made for you and me. This land is your land. This is Woody Guthrie, and very similar to sport or comic strips or whatever it is that you want to say, his music is very reflective. There are certain themes, issues, and concepts that are deeply embedded in Guthrie songs. Similarly, in literature, John Steinbeck wrote this really important book that would later become a movie called The Grapes of Wrath. And it chronicles this exodus. It's typically looked at as shameful migration out of Oklahoma, out of Arkansas, parts of Kansas and Texas on Route 66 into California to find jobs because people are being pushed off their land in places like Oklahoma, in Arkansas. These tenant farmers are packing up everything that they have and they're beat up old Ford Model Ts and they're heading out, and it's just harrowing, terrible story after terrible story. It's chronicling the experience of the Joad family as they look for work in the midst of the Great Depression. Very emblematic of the American experience in the Great Depression. In the realm of theater, you've got a guy by the name of Clifford Odets, who, in my own humble opinion, is one of the greatest American playwrights in the history of American theater. Wrote this really great play that he would later win an award for. It was called Waiting for Lefty, and it talks about a taxi cab strike in New York City. And very clearly, at a time when workers are sitting down and staging sit-down strikes in places like Flint, Michigan, workers are fighting with their bosses for the most basic of union recognition. This spoke to the American experience in the Great Depression. It was very reflective of the great union drives of the Great Depression. But once again, in the world of music, theater, and literature, you see this spirit of collectivism. It's very reflective of our political culture. We've talked about the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, that put workers to work building roads and bridges throughout the country, public works projects. These were completed by unemployed workers, and on the one hand, it put them to work, gave them something to do, and gave them a little bit of a paycheck to do it. More importantly, what they built were things that were very useful to the American people. Well, I mean, the Depression wasn't simply relegated to industrial workers. You have unemployed writers and unemployed sculptors, unemployed painters, unemployed artists, broadly defined. Along comes the Federal Arts Project later on in the New Deal era, and what it does is it provides federal money for the arts, again, broadly defined. It put mural painters, these big paintings on the side of government buildings, murals, put them to work painting the American experience in the Great Depression. Put sculptors to work erecting statues and sculptures in public parks. One of my favorites, the Federal Writers Project, commissioned unemployed writers, journalists, professors, teachers to go into the rural South and interview people that had grown up in the day and age of slavery. And these interviews were not only chronicled, but they were also recorded, and you could actually listen to them today. And so very similar to the WPA that's providing this infrastructure that's useful to the American people, the Federal Arts Project is rounding up these individuals, putting them to work, trying to get them spending money again, but it's providing art for the masses. This isn't art for your typical consumers of art. This is art to be consumed by people like Jurgis Rudkis, the working class of America. It was this culture of inclusion that has now come to the arts. One Federal Arts Project worker, employee that I'd like you to be mindful of would be a photographer by the name of Dorothea Lange. Dorothea Lange was commissioned to chronicle the suffering of the American people, generally through what you and I would probably call photojournalism. If you're looking at the screen along with me, she's chronicling agrarian poverty in the countryside. She's taking pictures of bread lines, people standing in line, and the great irony being they're standing in line for a bowl of soup in Chicago, and outside the place that's serving them the soup are these great big massive grain elevators that are packed to the gills full of grain. You've got this level of hunger, starvation, depravity, poverty in the land of plenty. It's teeming with food, it's teeming with these resources. And a lot of the reason that we know what we know about the American experience in the Great Depression, a lot of this has to do with Dorothy Lange. Um, I want to sum up and conclude by talking about the legacy of the New Deal. One thing that I want to make sure that you understand, there are critics on both sides of this equation. To the people on the right, what this did was it destroyed the institution of American individualism, right? We've been talking about that for a long time in this class. We know it's a very key and important concept. The idea that it's purifying, that it's good, it's wholesome, that if the government doesn't do it for you, it'll force you to do it and thereby become a better individual. In short, what these critics are saying is that the government had overstepped its boundaries and it was taking over various realms of American life, and that was bad. And just like there were critics on the right, there were critics on the left that felt that the government did not go far enough. It did not include enough people. It did not do enough to really provide the mechanisms for people to lift themselves out of poverty. The central essence of this, however, would be a redefinition of American liberalism. Um, Up until this point in our class, what liberalism had really driven at was providing protection for those people that could not protect themselves. Keep in mind that Teddy Roosevelt is going to develop this notion of the square deal, the idea that you're going to hold corporations and powerful Americans accountable for their actions. The federal government is going to essentially play the role of referee. Well, Franklin Roosevelt comes along, and with his New Deal, basically the question that he asks is why stop there? Why stop with just the federal government playing the role of referee and holding people accountable if they step out of bounds? The federal government ought to be the guarantor of a certain level of subsistence in American life. That under the New Deal and this concept of American liberalism, the federal government would, in fact, guarantee a basic minimum level of existence in American life. Um, Maybe a better way of talking about this is that what the federal government would assure the American people of would be security. Okay? Security from the threats of industrial capitalism and the threat of economic depression. Later on, it would guarantee the American people's safety from international fascism. In the aftermath of that, international communism. It would guarantee civil rights. It would guarantee the equalities of opportunity. It's a reshuffling of this American political culture and this new definition of liberalism, providing security, making life more secure. This is going to come to dominate the American political culture really for the next 30 years. Now, you will see Republican presidents, you will see Republican takeovers of Congress, but even by Republican standards, this new political culture that emphasizes providing security is going to be very, very meaningful. And even Republican presidents like Dwight Eisenhower are really going to at least have to pay lip service to this conceptualization of providing basic levels of security. The great divider, guys, that would be race. For those of you that have been following along with me, you know that for all of his political wizardry, one of the things that Franklin Roosevelt was never able to get off the ground was a federal anti-lynching law. Now, is this a failure? Very clearly it is. You don't see really any serious civil rights legislation in the 1930s, primarily because FDR and the New Deal Democrats felt that they needed the American South, and this was a non-starter in the American South at this particular moment. However, the way that I like to look at the New Deal when it comes to civil rights is no, it didn't really produce any meaningful civil rights legislation, but it does lay in place a very important infrastructure, a very important foundation that would allow another generation of reform-minded American politicians a foundation to work and launch meaningful civil rights legislation and meaningful civil rights reform. You'll see what I'm talking about once we get to the post-war era. For right now, guys, that's where I want to end it. I'll see you later.